Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Our History on the Scales, episode 5, How Do We Trust Reports? So this is going to be a very special episode. In the original episode by Dr. Tariq, this episode was a group of general points about what are the principles to abide by when analyzing reports. Since it was a bit of a mix between modern academic and traditional approaches, I decided it was better to first address the assumptions of both approaches and then discuss the details of each method in future episodes. Really what I mean by this is in Dr. Tariq's series, of course, he's addressing a Middle Eastern audience, and the Eastern Academy has already kind of developed an interdisciplinary approach, right? Like if you go to the average Islamic university, then they will use, to study history, then they will use a mix of traditional and sort of modern methods to form historical books and narratives and the like. With the West, the thing about the West is that it's not quite so much. The Western Academy is still very, hasn't fully swallowed, let's say, or hasn't fully accepted even Eastern sources as legitimate sources of history. And so the differences in the assumptions levels and in the sources level is still quite big, and that needs addressing. So the average person if you've grown up and born in the West, then a lot of these assumptions are so deeply entrenched, and you've maybe never questioned them. And so we'll talk about these assumptions first, address them, talk about what are the Eastern assumptions, right? The Islamic assumptions, traditional Islamic assumptions in particular, and then compare and contrast the differences between them, right? With that said, so this episode is going to be not really much of a translation. It's going to be a very original work. And inshallah there'll be a full translation of what he said maybe in future episodes. That's also one of the reasons there was a big delay, is that in my initial version I realized it didn't really make sense to a Western audience, the content I was translating, and so I'll make this and then translate the rest in the future. Barakallahu feek. So what is trustworthy? In the modern world, certain things are considered inherently more trustworthy than others. Scientific institutions are considered inherently more reliable, academic than, say, religious, faith-based sources. On a much more fundamental level, the modern academy has prioritized, and these are really going to be the 3 points that we look at throughout this episode, objective, neutral perspectives, and prize them over biased ones. Meanwhile, contemporary primary sources are sort of seen as the things that you have to build your research on, rather than later secondary sources. And lastly, mass quantitative data is kind of seen as more reliable, more important, more authoritative than individual qualitative reports. So we'll discuss each one of these one by one. And it's important to understand that these aren't specific. Everything I mentioned here isn't really specific only to history. This is true on all academic levels, right? In the sciences, in the humanities, all studies. If you ever want to write a PhD, these things are ingrained into you on a very fundamental level. Even things that you would think are a bit more qualitative. We'll get into that. Anyways, let's move on. So first what we're going to talk about is objectivity versus bias. So this is probably the biggest one, most important one. If you can understand this, then the rest kind of falls into place naturally. So in the Western modern approach, objectivity is in many ways the ultimate objective, pun intended. A historian must always remain objective and to remove any hint of his human bias. As Leopold von Ranke, the German scholar pictured here, it's kind of seen as the father of modern history in many ways, in the late 1800s, he would say, one of his famous quotes, "Only say how it really was." We're talking about a guy who really dedicated his life to removing bias from the books that he wrote, that he found in the books that he read. And so everything after him is particularly history in the modern academic tradition really became, you can say, this sort of or attempted to be this very sort of quote-unquote objective framework, right? This kind of zoomed out, not really clearly taking a side, trying to imagine you're like this third person who doesn't have a say or a bias towards everyone. But the question is, when you see this kind of unique perspective and how recent it is, one question is, why did humanity never do this before, right? Like, did the West just discover how to properly do history 200 years ago? Or is there something more to it? And once we look at the history of the Western tradition, and we can see why they did so. It came from a background of hundreds of years of religious wars, particularly in the 1600s, right? Over interpretation of Christian texts that were never really settled due in large part to the lack of early analysis of Christian texts of the first 1200 years, right? We already talked a little bit about this when we discussed the Isnad. You check that in episode 2. But basically, Christians lacked much isnad at all for the first 300 years, and then it becomes pretty much 100% zero and fully centralized. Whatever the church says goes from that point up until the 1500s, right? So from the 300s to the 1500s, it's actually very, very hard, and modern Christian scholarship is still really working hard to map out what are the changes that happened in the text, why did they happen, what are the interlopations that have now been kind of accepted and are just permanent parts of the Bible. Because the central church, particularly in Rome, controlled everything so much, it really wasn't until the 1500s, with Martin Luther being really the first successful Protestant movement, do we start having differences, do we start having real differences of interpretation and real textual criticism. But the wars that erupted from these different interpretations could never really be settled due in large, like academically, due in large parts to these this gap, right? Meanwhile, Islamic differences of opinion in interpretation can be somewhat easily settled by just looking at the evidences. And by settled, I don't mean each person accepting the same opinion, but each person sort of understanding how different people can come to the same opinion, right? But if two different people have like a whole, believe two verses have completely axiomatically opposed interpretations, on a certain level, you can't really coexist, right? Like one person is right, the other person is an evil liar, and you have to prove each other's truth at the end of a blade. Anyway, moving on from the middle. By the 1600s, after these, really at the end of these religious wars, the search for the truth in the West began with the assumptions that these religious texts weren't worth digging into anymore. They were too biased, too religious, and too unreliable. Henceforth, historical truth was defined by objectivity, and this objectivity, often defined by its lack of religious bias, particularly, but again, the focus is on all bias, but really it's coming from a background of religious bias dominating, right? Because a lot of these differences, again, in the wars, come from different historical understandings of events, right? You don't just have different, and again, religious historical, because everything is religious still at this stage. So the Protestants looked at history, particularly the history of the church, very differently than the Catholics looked at history. And so when people kind of got fed up with both sides and were like, okay, but then what actually happened? Because their assumption is both of them are kind of lying, then yeah, it has to begin by pushing all of this religious bias outside, right? Now, the question is, we understand why the West became like that, right? But now let's look at what does this mean in practice, right? Like, what does it really mean to be objective? What does it mean to not have any bias? What does it mean to be neutral? So I love to always explore this concept by talking about the three kingdoms, right? And apologies to any of my Chinese viewers, right? Like no diss against you. But me personally, I don't know anything or close to not anything about Chinese history in general, and specifically the three kingdoms period. I know it's important in Chinese history. I know it's very often quoted over there. That's pretty much it. So if somebody were to come to me and ask me, hey, Mohammed, between the way, the woo, and shoe, which one do you think is the best? I would very honestly answer, I don't know. I don't know much of anything about them. I have no particular bias towards any of them. I am completely neutral. And what that means is, because of my lack of knowledge, I don't yet have an opinion about any of them. However, as soon as the asker, let's say, starts to give me information about these three kingdoms, oh, this was the Wei's religion. This was the Wei's racial background. This is why the Wu went to war against the Shu. Now, all of this information I will interpret them, and I will have to, just as a human being, begin to cast judgments on these characteristics of these three kingdoms. You know, I'm likely going to like the people who are more courageous, more honorable, and I'm going to dislike the kingdoms that appear to be bad. Maybe the kingdoms that appear to be more similar to the people who I seem to be bad, for example, and so on. This will happen firstly at a subconscious level, and then once I begin to acknowledge it, I'll realize, okay, actually, I like, let's say, the Shu more so than the Wu or the Wei, right? Like, even just looking at these three colors, you know, I like, between green, blue, and red, I like green, maybe, and then blue, and then red. So that's already, even that tiny bit of information already gives me that tiniest bit of bias. And so bias and so objectivity and neutrality can only really be there as long as you're ignorant about something, right? If you're assessing something, and as soon as you begin to have the tiniest information, then subconsciously you're already evaluating it and you're already applying judgments to it. Not even before you start to consciously apply judgments. Now, once you're consciously applying judgments, especially when you have a lot of information, and especially if you care about something, right? If it's a subject matter that I don't know anything about and I don't care about, then you can actually, it is possible to be actually objective and actually neutral towards it, because you don't know nothing about it. But the second you begin to consume information, the second neutrality becomes a myth. And that's where I'm going to go to the next point, right? Which is, permanent objectivity is a myth. Right? As an expert in a subject, your objectivity and neutrality can only be a temporary position that lasts until you accumulate enough information to form an opinion. A historian who is neutral towards the very subjects he studies makes as much sense as a doctor who is neutral against the diseases and curses that his patients complain about, or a barber who is objective regarding the hairstyles he designs, right? Like, every barber has a preferred hairstyle, a hairstyle that he believes is more fitting to certain people and not fitting to others, a hairstyle that he likes to give and he doesn't like to give. This is his area of expertise. He has so much information that he is bound to have cast countless conscious and subconscious judgments on it, which results in opinions. The same for a doctor, right? Dealing with diseases and cures. Only someone who's fully ignorant can be objective. And as soon as you start to learn and become an expert, you become biased. So bias, again, is not a bad thing. It's not an evil thing. When you start to scratch the surface within the academy, all of them like crumble basically when it comes to this. Like they all admit that they have bias and that they are actually biased and that they are motivated by that bias, right? But they still have to partake and do this whole pretending of being unbiased, because that's what they professionally have to do. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you have to be fanatical and overbearing with your biases. Again, we've already discussed this in the Senate episodes. Again, check episode 2. But simply acknowledge and be transparent with your bias. That's the best way to deal with your bias as a human being. Don't pretend that they're not there. Don't deny them. Don't try to hide them. Don't try to be polite about it. Admit them. Own it when it's relevant, right? Like, if you're, if I'm doing a history about the Islamic period, and I have a particular love for samurais, that's not particularly relevant there, right? So that's an example. And yes, that's all on the topic of objectivity and bias. Now for the next topic, which is primary versus secondary sources. Primary sources are defined as contemporary sources that have witnessed and written down their observations, right? So just think about someone, historian, in this specific time period, writing down what he observes and the events that he sees and lives during. Examples include carbon-dated scrolls, stone tablets, poetry, etc. Specifically in Islamic history, the Quran is generally considered to be a primary historical source for the time period, right? Even non-Muslims admit that the Quran, the earliest Quran that we have today, pictured here, right, the Uthmanic Codex, comes to the period of the early 8th century, right, the 700s AD. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are sources that come in later periods, writing the report and writings of others, right, or the second-hand reports of others. In Islamic history, hadith is generally considered to be secondary source because most of the corpuses that have reached us have been written down by people who are not contemporary to those events. In modern academia, a large amount of focus and effort is put on trusting and building on primary sources, while sidelining and casting a lot of doubt and sort of prejudice towards secondary sources. Is this approach really fair? Primary source limitations. Before I go into this, I'm just going to say the conclusion right away, which is that both primary and secondary sources have their place. Neither of them is perfect. Both of them have ideally they are complementary, right? And so when the West says only primary sources should be used in historical study, what are the issues with that approach, right? Number one is that you don't always have a primary source about a certain period or a certain event. So if you only have secondary sources, do you just have to pretend that that event never happened? Can you not trust anything about the secondary source? What about things? So, for example, let's look at Islamic history. There are many events described in the Quran whose full details are not found in the Quran itself. It's kind of, the Quran is very much responding to events at the time rather than intending to record them fully. And so you only get basically one small part of a bigger story, and you need secondary sources to fill in those gaps, right? Like, for example, let's say some verses, why were they revealed to the Prophet ﷺ? When were they revealed? What was the motivation behind them? Behind their reveal, what's the story behind them? It's impossible to find that inside the Quran itself. If you kind of imagine that the Quran was all revealed or made up at the same moment, at the same instance, and you can't tie it down to. That's also how we explain differences within the Quran, right? The Meccan period versus the Medinan period versus, and so on. It's impossible to avoid using secondary sources to further understand most primary sources, right? So you need both. The second point is, how did the primary source get to us? This is very, very, very much important. Once you begin to get into it, Western academia, there is this kind of imagination that we're going to go out there, we're going to get underneath the pyramids, find this lost tablet, decipher what it means, and that's going to give us a 100% accurate idea of what happened during the ancient Egypt and the pharaohs and all that. Now, obviously, that's just not true. There's like these primary sources don't always say the truth, right? I'm jumping right into the third point. But let's just say, for example, that I'm an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, and I decide to write a very propagandized version of what happened in ancient Egypt. And I, of course, write that in my own pyramids and in my own temples and whatnot. And then 3,000, 4,000 years later, this Western scholar is like, this is what the Egyptians wrote. This is a direct primary source. Therefore, it is 100% the truth. And we can believe it without further consideration. And everything that we have that is secondary sources, the Bible, the Quran, what have you, that will throw that in the water. That's definitely lying because we have a primary source. This is obviously a very uncritical, ironically, and a very prejudiced, and I don't know how else to say it. It's a very dumb way of approaching a complex topic. It's important to understand, why certain versions of history were written, by whom, what was their bias. There's no such thing again as an objective perspective in history. And so the question is, once you are dealing between two reports, whether one is primary or secondary, is which one is more likely to be true? Why is there a difference? Why am I picking this one over that one? All of these are relevant, right? And you can't simplify all of that debate by, oh, this is a primary source, therefore it is unquestionably the truth. It's not that simple. And secondary sources are also important. This is kind of, again, rehashing of the points I've already mentioned, but that they're all parts of the Senate, right? Secondary sources, how a source gets to us, everything that happened, right? And so, for example, let's look at the Quran, right? Some of the reasons that the Quran is so assuredly believed to be existent during the time of the Prophet ﷺ is that you have people debating its contents from that period, right? Whether it's the companions debating its interpretations, whether it's Christian scholars later in the region and outside responding to its claims, whether it's kings and queens responding to messages of Muslim rulers, quoting the Quran to reject it or to accept it. All of these references they're technically secondary sources, but they fill in again those gaps that are found in the primary sources. That they make the primary source even clearer, stronger, and its content and its meaning and its interpretations more clearly. Right? How a historical text has been interpreted. Let's say over 15. If a text has been interpreted for 1400 years one way, and then 100 years ago they were like, actually, you know what? I've read the primary source. I understand it better than all these 1400 years ago people. It's like, nah, bro, you're probably making things up. And the people who have how they've been understanding for 1400 years are probably more right. And that's the contextualization and parts of the Senate that the secondary source plays. And that's why ideally you should have as many sources as possible about the period, secondary and primary. They complement each other. The last topic we'll discuss today is qualitative versus quantitative. The last assumption when it comes to history. After the fall of the church's authority, Western society needed a new arbiter of truth, something measurable, generalizable, and replicable. And that's where numbers, and specifically statistical data, took the place of religious councils, right? Numbers, right? We already talked about the status quo, the mental status quo after the destructive religious wars in Europe. And so that hunger for quote unquote real truth that no one can religiously debate over came, and that's where numbers really best fit in. Numbers appear at the surface to be more true than anything else. It's hard to argue against 1 + 1 = 2. So statistics, which are based off of numbers, obviously, as a science, slowly turned into an obsession of turning everything, regardless of if it makes sense or not, into numbers, into numerical metrics, and KPIs that can be measured, compared, and optimized. These metrics combined into even bigger metrics, leading to behemoths like GDP that the average mind, and really most experts, can't begin to comprehend. What is the effect of the focus on qualitative and the devaluation of qualitative data? Quantitative versus qualitative. The shift led to the early success of the natural sciences, right? No one can deny this, that there was an explosion in things like physics, chemistry, and computer science in that period, in large part due to this new focus and prioritization of natural sciences based on statistics and on numbers, right? The amount of discoveries and achievements made in a few hundred years were very impressive. However, this also led to confusion and failure in other fields, right? Perhaps most self-evidently is in the field of economics. The attempt to simplify human markets down to predictable variables has had limited uses. So just to be clear, I do believe that there are some good ideas in modern economics, but it's very niche uses, and the way it is actually being used by governments and by major companies to predict the economy and so on is just way beyond what it is able to do. And everyone knows that every expert working in this in this field knows that it is very problematic, to say the least. I'm saying this not as an outsider. I actually have a master's degree in economic data analysis with a minor in official statistics, right? I've worked in the statistical office in the Czech Republic. You can check by LinkedIn if need be. I've worked in the Czech census of 2021. I've seen this, from deep in the trenches, as they say. According to the principles and models of economics, Japan and Argentina should have been, bankrupt, failed economies decades ago. Yet only are they around, although Argentina is not that successful, they've been relatively thriving through the majority of their supposed stagnation. Right. The one famous quote by Simon Kisnet is that there are 4 types of countries: developed, underdeveloped, Japan, and Argentina. Just because both Japan and Argentina don't fit into the models and the assumptions of the developed and underdeveloped countries that supposedly always fit, which, by the way, they also don't, but Japan and Argentina are just kind of the biggest exceptions. That's why they always come up in discussions, economic discussions. And maybe one more point here is that right now we're kind of living through exceptional economic circumstances post the Iran war, right? No, there was not a single economist who predicted what was happening right now in the not just the raise of gas prices, but the shortages in like the most basic of world goods, fertilizers, the way it's impacted the US economy, the way it's impacted Southeast Asian economies. I remember even when the war began, they were saying, "Oh, it's going to." The economists were saying it's going to take 2 months before we're going to see any price increase in Malaysia. Within that same week, we had a price increase. So again, the science is very bad. So I'm just or bad at doing what it pretends to do. It's good at very, very limited niche control settings. Understanding how once you control for certain variables, how certain things in the economy affect others, but not to predict entire futures, right? Which is what economy as a field is sold as, right? And how the popular imagination of it is. Anyways, taking a bit too long here. Now, am I the first person to criticize statistics? No, there's been many thinkers throughout Western history who have actually criticized it. Right. Pictured in the top right here, we have Julius Evola. As he postulates, reality is understood through qualities, right? Qualitative data. Maybe I should have explained this before I jumped in, because I'm already kind of assuming my own listeners knows the difference. But it's quantitative data means data about numbers. Qualitative is like basically not numbers, right? Text-based, what we would call biased or opinionated sort of data or information. Hierarchies exist is his second point, which is, we value things that are higher, things that are more noble, and we don't value things that are lower, things that are base, and therefore modern approaches that reduces these realities and pretend them not to, or to be equal and treat them the same, confuse these ideas, right? This leveling of reality obscures the truth in the name of recording it. Right. Quantification creates equivalent comparability and standardization. When you think about it, again, this has so many psychological effects. Like, for example, in the modern day, the average person wants to be average, which is, again, kind of has never been the case historically. The average people always want to be the best. They look up to the best. They don't want to be the average person. But in the modern day, there's this kind of almost glorification of the average that comes from standards of mean being used everywhere, right? Like, oh, this is the average American, this is the median household income, this is and everyone is kind of wants to just be the average. Don't be poor. You don't really incentivize to be rich. If you become rich, sure. Like deep down, everybody actually wants to be rich, but at least the popular conception pushes more the average. And that's a very modern thing. And it kind of, again, screws our values, but also screws like actual reality and the way we record history. It erases distinction, important distinction, right? A saint and a criminal being 2 data points in a census makes that census very useless to the average person, right? I don't care what the average criminal, I don't know, pays in taxes or something. He's a criminal. I was talking like criminal, right? Like gangster levels of people. But within censuses and these things, they're all treated the same. Of course, it eerily reminds me of this verse. Should we treat those who have submitted should we treat those who have submitted to the truth the same as criminals? What is wrong with you? Where is your judgment? Verse from the Quran, right? And again, all of these judgments are qualitative data. A lot of emphasis is put on not recording them, or when they are recorded, to dismiss reports that are recording them. So many problems within problems. And again, quantity just doesn't really give us much information, much interesting information about how people live, right? So what do we do? As always, a balanced approach is needed. Numbers have their place. Certain things are easily quantifiable. For example, states need to know, like for a state, it is important to know what the average person is up to, what's the average median income, just to know how much work needs to be done to help the average level of poverty and so on. But too much focus on it and basing the whole existence on it, and forcing things that are not quantifiable to be quantifiable is where problematic things come, right? Objective methods are good at studying objects, not so much for the unseen things such as human nature, right? This is very relevant in psychology and even in medicine, where some things are quantifiable, other things really aren't. If you want to understand human nature, statistics and quantifying things just isn't going to help you as much as more human methods. In history in particular, which is a bit of a mixed discipline between quantifiable elements and qualitative, you do need a bit of both. For example, bias measurement, understanding how biased your source is a purely qualitative expertise. How biased is the report you are reading? Is it so biased such that it is falsifying reality to make it appear different to what it really is, or is it just merely exaggerating here and there? Distinguishing between these subtle differences are paramount for a student of history, and it's a skill that you simply develop by analyzing it, right? An example of utilizing both quantitative and qualitative methods can be found in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, where he says, this is a full direct quote, "The historians, commentators, and transmitters of traditions have committed many errors in regards to the stories and events that they have reported. The reason is that they have accepted them without investigation or critical examination. Among such errors is what has been mentioned about the number of the Israelites at the time of Moses. It is stated that the Israelites who left Egypt numbered 600,000 fighting men, not counting women and children. This would imply a total population of more than 1 million. Such a number is impossible. Egypt and Syria together could not support such a multitude, let alone Egypt alone. Nor could they be governed or organized. The available land and conditions would not allow for such a population. This shows that such reports are exaggerated and not based on reality." End quote. And here's an example, a bit of a cheeky example from our own episode. I believe this is from episode 3, where we talked about Ibn Khaldun's stages of development. So this is the Umayyad dynasty, and this is the same exact visual that Dr. Tariq uses to show that, the Umayyad dynasty sort of rose and fall, beginning from Muawiyah's time all the way to the period of Marwan ibn Abd al-Hakam. Now the question is, this is a very familiar graph, known as sort of the Dorval distribution, bell curve, if you will. But the question is, what is actually being numerically measured here? It's like, did the watchers who watch this just assume that the person reporting the graph is reporting a number and reporting it accurately and honestly? The truth is that Dr. Tariq wasn't using any numbers at all. He's just trying to communicate, right, where things start, where things ended, and that things were kind of, cool and amazing during the period of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and not so much during the period of Marwan. But these don't represent any numbers. Like, this graph is fake on a very fundamental level, even though, like, the image it is, of course, describing is true, but the method by which it is kind of, let's just say, dishonest. At the beginning, right? And I'm saying this as a student, as a big fan of Tana. Like everyone does this in statistics, right? Like utilizing a graph in a very misleading way. So this is just, and I did use the same graph, so I gave no, well, with the intention of kind of talking about it in more detail in the future. This kind of to show you that, like, look, statistics and using these statistical methods have their limitations. Qualitative information like flourishing and consolidation and emergence can't be quantified. I might visually show it to you as if it's quantified, but these things can't be quantified. They're just vibes, effectively. Although I guess, I mean, if you really want to be pedantic, you can use things that are quantifiable to measure how things are flourishing in the modern day. But that's neither here nor there. Point made. End quote. And this end quote is from yours truly, just like the whole episode really is. Every era has different methodologies to get to the truth. The seeker of truth will use every tool at their disposal, like an investigator examining every clue. Trust not the investigator who's not ready to get their hands dirty, sticking only to the findings of labs and reports outside of their direct oversight. Above all else, your heart will know the truth when it knows it. As the Prophet ﷺ said, don't forget to ask your heart, even if they have showered you with their opinions. They being, experts. And he repeated this last statement 3 times. استفتي قلبك وإن أفتوك وإن أفتوك وإن أفتوك. Thank you very much for listening. Been a pleasure. Like, subscribe, share this video. It's going to be a lot more, inshallah, community-based things after this episode. So I'm looking to start our own Discord channel. So if you're excited about that, feel free to join in the links that will be available below. Barakallahu feekum, and I'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.